afternoon, everyone. We're going to get ready for our next session. And to introduce our next session is Samantha Stedford from the Airport Authority of Allegheny County.
Hi, everyone. I'm Samantha Stedford. I'm with Pittsburgh International Airport, and I'm here to introduce this panel on 100% clean or 100% renewable or zero carbon and why it matters. A national debate is brewing about whether setting goals toward 100% renewable or 100% carbon zero is the singular answer to address climate change. Many are advocating a deliberate, overt shifting of focus from 100% renewable to 100% clean or 100% zero carbon. This should not only be the focus of public policy, but of corporate purchasing, city procurement, and individual clean, green tariffs. A growing group of academics, including Carnegie Mellon University, are at the center of this discussion. This panel includes an array of industry leadership, academics, and government officials who will speak to their views on how and why to create a third way. Moderating this panel is Granger Morgan. He is a professor of engineering and public policy here at Carnegie Mellon University. Granger Morgan is a professor of engineering at Carnegie Mellon. His research addresses problems in science, technology, and public policy, with a particular focus on energy, electric power, environmental systems, climate change, the adoption of new technologies, and risk analysis. Jeff Nair is Vice President of Business Development at Peoples Gas. Jeffrey is an accomplished leader, respected executive, and results-focused professional with demonstrated success in directing the life cycle of responsibilities associated with the leadership of large-scale operations. Jeremy Harrell is a managing director of policy at ClearPath. ClearPath is a research and advocacy organization focused on promoting free market ideas that encourage innovation and accelerate clean energy deployment. Brian Anderson is the Director of National Energy Laboratory for the U.S. Department of Energy, where he manages delivery and execution of the laboratory's national research programs in fossil energy. Denise Brindley serves as the Executive Director of Governor Wolf's Office of Energy, a newly formed office that is housed within the Department of Community and Economic Development. Ms. Brindley will coordinate energy-related matters between state agencies, businesses, nonprofits, and other organizations in the energy sector. Jill Engel-Cox is the director of the Joint Institute for Strategic Analysis at the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And that is our panel, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. We thought we might start by just asking each of the panel members to talk for a minute or two about what they think is most important that we discuss, and then for the next 20 or 30 minutes we're going to try to have a group conversation here, and then we will open it up for questions from the floor, although my guess is that given the nature of the topic we would have no difficulty talking together for at least an hour. And so, Brian, why don't we start out with you and just a minute or two that sort of highlights of what you think it's most important we talk about, and then we'll just go around the group.
Sure. So as mentioned, the National Energy Technology Laboratory is the U.S. Department of Energy's fossil energy laboratory. And so it's very interesting to be in this conversation because at the surface, fossil energy might be the enemy. In fact, though, when we think about pathways to sustainability, pathways to a low-carbon future, we think that it is absolutely critical that we develop technologies to reduce the carbon footprint of our fossil fuels. And so a large part of our portfolio in the lab and the Office of Fossil Energy is focused on carbon capture, utilization, sequestration, as well as increasing the efficiency of fossil energy production writ large. And so I think that a key part of that conversation is how we can develop innovations and technology to help drive down the carbon footprint, the emissions footprint of all energy sources, including fossil. And then one last thing that might not be readily apparent to everybody is, yes, we're the fossil energy laboratory. One unique aspect is we are the only laboratory of the 17 U.S. Department of Energy labs that is a government-operated laboratory. And through that, we actually provide a lot of project management and direction for even the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, as well as the Office of Electricity and the newly formed Office for Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. And so we have a unique aspect of both being federal in management, but also in innovation and research.
Jeremy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a great conversation to be having. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ClearPath, we work largely on federal policy in Washington, D.C., and this very topic is kind of the heat of the debate in the Green New Deal and strategies to address climate. And so I think the first thing to say is it's wonderful that we're having this conversation, because ultimately the bigger picture is we're working under the assumption that we need to drive down emissions, right? So whether it's 100% renewable, 100% clean, we're driving towards that end objective. And frankly, I think that's the key point here, is it's not about the technology, it's about the objective, and that's reducing carbon emissions. And so I think that's important. I think a couple things to think about as you think about this debate and the talk about the technologies. Can renewables do the job? Can we get there 100%? Maybe, but I wouldn't bet the planet on it. There is some theoretical work out there. You guys might be familiar with kind of the big blow up that occurred with Mark Jacobson, a Stanford professor, late last year, and the kind of intense debate, academic debate on the feasibility of getting 100% renewables. But I'd like to focus on a few things on the practical side that I think are important to note. On the government side, we saw California set an ambitious CO2 emissions goal to get to 60% renewables by 2035, but then to get to the 0 point in 2045 with a technology-inclusive agenda. We've seen Excel launch the biggest investor-owned utility target earlier this year to drive towards 60% or 80% renewables by 2035, and they kind of explicitly lay out that there are some real technological and technical barriers to getting to 100, and so that you need firm, flexible technologies. And then a big rush in the corporate procurement space in particular, and I think Google is one of the more in the forefront that have been pushing out and saying that we need to get 24/7 power from zero-emission technologies, not just picking renewables. So I think we're seeing kind of across the spectrum here in the U.S., governments, private sector entities, and corporates kind of driving towards the same end goal. And again, I think it's a matter of climate urgency, right? If we believe that we need to reduce CO2 emissions, it's how we get to those emissions reductions from a cheapest, fastest, and the least impact to the consumer while meeting our electricity needs. And in our view, at least, that's a technology-inclusive vision.
Jill.
All right, thank you very much. I'm with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory with my sister lab from NETL. We're the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Lab out in Colorado. I'm with a center that looks at the intersection between renewables and fossil energy and nuclear energy. So my center actually looks at, does the analysis around those connections, because we also believe that there will be a mix is very important to trying to achieve these goals. Earlier, I want to have a couple points. An earlier speaker had mentioned that a lot of things arose out of the 1970s and some of the oil price shocks that were happening at that time. NREL is one of those. We started out as the Solar Energy Research Institute in 1977. And at that time, solar photovoltaic cells were $77 a watt. And now they have dropped greater than 99% to 35 cents a watt, and that's for the entire panel. And so that is the reason we're really able to have this conversation now, is that the price of these technologies has dropped so precipitously. And a lot of that is because of R&D that has been done at the DOE labs and other labs around the world to help improve not only the efficiency of those panels and efficiency of those cells, but also reducing the number and the price of the amount and the price of materials in them, and actually advancing the manufacturing so that you can manufacture them in a mass-produced way. And that innovation is going to continue. And so I think in our conversation today, one thing to think about is not only where we are with technologies now, but how will these progress in the same 40-year time frame, or even the same 10-year time frame, which is where we saw 70% of the reduction of those panels. The one other point I want to also make is that we talk a lot about renewables, and we seem to often, when we say that, mean solar and wind, because those are the ones that have been most advanced. But those are the two variable renewables. And so then you do have to get into solutions that look into batteries and other types of power systems. But I think it's important to know that renewables are diverse. There are many, many other renewable technologies that are pretty established: geothermal, hydropower. There are countries that are operating 100% renewable power now, largely because of geothermal and hydropower. And there are advances in those technologies that are coming. So if you look at a lot of the easy geothermal is done, but if we could pull some of the advances with hydraulic fracturing and bring that into geothermal power, you can actually go into hot rock that doesn't currently have water and insert the water in there and begin geothermal power. So that is not a commercial technology, but that's one that could be coming. And then a variety of things around hydropower in terms of wave and water and small microturbines that could be advanced. So I'd like to make sure in our conversation we include the full suite of renewable and technologies. And I think that's what's really going to be important, is some of the advances in those technologies will help us achieve these goals.
So, Jill, many people in this room presumably already know, but give us some sense. Wind today is what, about 7%, just under 7% of all electricity generated?
Right, wind is just about 7%. It's getting close to
solar,
surpassing nuclear.
And solar is at about?
Solar in the U.S. nationally is about 2%.
Yeah, right.
But if you look at it at a statewide basis, California is already 16%.
There are states that are quite different.
Right,
yeah.
so I think the key is that you have to look at it from a localized state or country level, because the mixes can be quite different depending on where you are.
So, Denise.
To Carnegie Mellon for having the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania here today. We are a really interesting state, and I think it's worth noting for the audience here that Pennsylvania has been an energy state for as long as many of us can remember. Someone in the opening comments mentioned our connectivity to coal. We're certainly part of the Industrial Revolution. We have a natural gas resource that dwarfs everywhere else in the nation. We're third in the world in terms of the size of the natural gas resource. We have an electrical grid that, combined with 13 other states, we produce the most electricity in the United States. We're a net exporter of our electricity that's being generated here. So we also have a nuclear fleet. I'm sure many of you are tracking stories about our nuclear fleet as they hit the press, and how we may or may not have a nuclear fleet going forward. Just depends on who you talk to. So with all of that information in front of us, it begs the question, if we're producing all of this energy here, and we have tremendous energy resources that are actually fairly diverse, creating a fairly resilient grid, how do we get to the goals that we're looking at us in the future? What does that mean? And how do we bring together a stakeholder base that is very divergent and has different interests at the table? I think that's the question that's facing Pennsylvania right now, and we have the opportunity to really lead the world in that regard, because we have everything on the plate. And not many other states have that type of advantage. We do look at it as an advantage. Earlier this year, Governor Wolf signed an executive order in January of 2019 establishing carbon reduction goals of 26% by 2025 and 80% by 2050. So that should give you an idea of the direction that Pennsylvania is going. We know we have a tremendous opportunity in front of us, and government will lead by example. Part of that executive order includes how our Commonwealth agencies will respond by energy efficiencies in their owned buildings. For many of you who don't know, the Commonwealth owns a lot of property, and we have a great opportunity to really latch on to some great energy efficiency projects and bring our own carbon reductions down in the process. We'll also be making investments in electric vehicles for our own fleet and hoping to, as I said, lead by example. One other thing that I'd like to mention about Pennsylvania and some of the work that we've done that will hint or intimate on the direction we're going, and that is that last year we finished a process called Pennsylvania Energy Horizons, where we pulled 40 people together to talk about what Pennsylvania's energy system would or could look like in 25 years. And out of that process, we developed 2 long-range energy scenarios. No other state in the United States has done this. So I ask you to please pay attention to these scenarios because they were critically important to showcasing how energy is critically tied to our socioeconomics, our culture, and our politics. So going back to your question is, what do we need to know today to move towards a lower carbon future? It's how do we attack all of the variables that we're not already looking at? We've had these goals for many, many years. Too long for me to mention because then I'm going to date myself in this process, but in graduate school we were studying global warming, and that phrase isn't even used anymore. We've managed to work through climate change and then climate adaptation and climate mitigation. It's been going on for a long time. The question I think we need to ask ourselves is, what is it that is holding us back? Because it's very easy to sit in rooms like this and talk about our mutual shared goals of a lower carbon future. It's much harder to figure out why we're not getting there.
Jeff.
Thank you to Carnegie Mellon for having People's Gas here. We're a gas distribution utility, but we're also here to promote responsible use of natural gas. And one of the things that we really feel is the future is working with on-site generation versus generation from central power plants. We feel that the efficiencies are there, creating 2 energy sources, both heat and electricity, right on site, so that it reduces emissions but also improves efficiency and saves money for our customers. We're also a big proponent of fuel cells, which are also a responsible way to use natural gas with almost 0 emissions. So the thought being that homeowners can benefit from using natural gas to generate electricity, which isn't really subject to weather or to sunlight or to conditions that are, things that are, barriers to renewables. It's more of a steady state, or it could be complementary to renewables as well. People's Gas is also big on, and we're one of the early adopters of renewable natural gas, which is really a big buzzword with the AGA right now. And in renewable natural gas, it comes from landfills or from agriculture or from digesters at waste treatment plants. But Peoples has been connected to about 5 landfills for over 10 years. We're going to add another one this year. Probably about a BCF annually of renewable natural gas goes through our pipelines. And we're excited to do more of that. And we actually help other utilities think about how to use that within their operations and how to successfully manage that type of gas source. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Well, I want to take us back to the title that has this awkward 100% in it. So we're 7% wind now, we're a couple percent solar. We've got an enormous way to go in terms of decarbonizing or cleaning the energy system. So I'd like to talk for a minute or two about just what the obstacles are to getting there from here. For example, we heard about carbon capture and deep geologic sequestration. But at the moment, given that there's no constraint on carbon emissions, nobody in the private sector has much of an incentive to do anything. We ran a study in Carnegie Mellon a year or so ago in which we discovered that the average American thinks that the typical residence time of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is almost exactly the same as the typical residence time of normal air pollution. Normal air pollution, they overestimate. I mean, it in fact resides in the atmosphere. If you stopped all emissions, it would all be gone in a few hours or days. But we're sitting here breathing air that includes CO2 that was emitted in Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution a couple hundred years ago. Once you put CO2 in the atmosphere, much of it stays there for centuries. And so the notion that, you know, if this ever gets bad enough, we'll just fix it, like we cleaned up air in Pittsburgh or we cleaned up air in Los Angeles, isn't going to work, because at that point we're stuck. So let's talk about the 100%. Is it plausible that we can buy, I mean, certainly not in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of some of the students sitting out here, get the U.S. to the point that we're 100%, or maybe even below that, because the current projections suggest that if you want to stay at 2 or 3 degrees, you're probably going to have to move on to net negative emissions. So let's start first with the deep geologic sequestration, and maybe you'd like to say a few words, and then I want to talk with you about the issue of accepting deep injection in Pennsylvania. But first, talk to us a little bit about, is this technology, are we ever going to see this at commercial scale? I understand there are a few.
We actually already are.
Yeah, but I mean, I mean in bulk.
Right. Well, and you hit on one of the biggest barriers, and it's the economic incentive that comes with adding on to an existing process. If we install a wind turbine and it falls at a price point where it's going to be purchased within a day ahead bid or a 5-minute ahead bid within the electricity sector, and you immediately see the return on that investment.
Yeah, well, the same was true for sulfur pollution, and until we had standards, nobody would add.
But that's the exact point. I mean, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And so until there is truly that financial incentive, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's a cap and trade, whatever model it is, we're not going to see commercial deployment.
Jeremy, how are we going to get it?
Yeah, I would say something that kind of went under the radar last year was a big tax deal at the federal level was enacted in the spring of 2018 and established what's called the 45Q tax credit, which essentially sets a tax incentive to capture CO2 from point sources. And that credit ramps up over the course of time until you reach like a certain deadline, a 2026 commence construction deadline moving forward. And as we talk to major project developers, we think this is going to be a game changer for the carbon capture industry. It creates an incentive in place to deploy and can help meet some of that gap that we have of taking the technologies out of the lab and getting them to commercial deployment. And why I think it's so important, I think it's something that I'll just give you an example. So Boundary Dam, one of the largest CCS projects in the world, that's a coal CCS facility in Canada. The project proponent of that recently said they're going to move forward with their second version of that project, and the second build they estimate will be 67% cheaper than the first time they did it. Inherently, when we deploy these things first, they're extremely expensive, and we need to learn by doing. And this incentive is going to help continue that and get the natural increases while also creating an incentive moving forward. So I think over the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see quite a few projects, both in the industrial and power sector, announced.
And I agree. 45Q, there's a lot of industrial interest in 45Q. It creates two different ways to approach the tax incentive. One is through EOR, which is a lower tax incentive, and the other is through sequestration. And so in terms of scaling up the commercial, Petronova is the largest in the United States, largest commercial scale carbon capture. It utilizes EOR, but there are a number of projects in the pipeline to try to tackle 45Q. Right now, there are some issues in the Department of Treasury and how that is actually implemented through the IRS tax code.
Okay, can you tell me a story where we see 60, 70% of natural gas and coal captured and sequestered in the next 30 years? I have trouble envisioning that future.
Well, the price point for capture is the biggest barrier right now.
Yeah.
And the price point for capture is somewhere around $50 to $60 per ton of CO2, which is above the tax credit you get. We are seeing technology pathways through the project partners we have at NETL and with our own in-house research that's already bringing that down to the level of $45 and potentially even $40 per ton. And so we can see a pathway within the next 2025, 2030 where we can get to $30 per metric ton of CO2 to capture, and then we start to see that commercialization at the large scale.
I was going to comment on the CCUS. I think the thing that we often forget is the U part, and I think that's where you may be able to monetize CCUS. Is that I came from an industrial pollution prevention background, and treating the waste is always the last thing you want to do if you're just going to store it. But if you can make something out of it, you can bring the concepts of circular economy to this, and then actually be able to capture it and create it into new fuels, into cement, into calcium carbonate, into other things that we can actually produce. That's where you're going to be able to monetize it rather than strictly bury it.
But those of us who live in Pittsburgh see these 100-car coal trains go by day after day. 70, 80% of that is carbon, and in a few days, it's all going to be made into an invisible gas and put into the atmosphere. There's a limit to how much of this stuff we can actually use, which takes me to you, which is to talk a little bit about deep geologic sequestration. Pennsylvania does not have as large a resource for deep geologic sequestration as, for example, Ohio, but we do have a significant resource. I'm concerned about public pushback. When I talk to folks at the DOE, they say we got enormous underground capacity, and that's true. But suppose we start getting induced seismicity, suppose we can't just jack the earth up, we have to pull the brine out and treat it. I can imagine enormous public difficulties. Have you, at the state, thought about these issues at all yet? And I'm sorry to put you on the spot. I should have asked you this back in the... And you can simply say, no, Granger, let me talk about something else.
I don't think that Pennsylvania is as deep in the weeds as you are on these topics right now. We have state geologists who have supported conceptually CCS in Pennsylvania, storing underground. We store natural gas right now underground. We've looked at storing ethane underground. All of these topics have a host of public perception issues, and that comes along with the territory of the technology and what is being proposed. We take that one step at a time in making sure that the public is aware of any potential activity and that they're fully informed and educated. But with the diverse fleet mix that Pennsylvania has, and I do want to respond to your coal comments because there is something important happening in Pennsylvania that hasn't been mentioned, and that is that we've had 14 coal-fired power plants close since 2010.
Sure, because gas is so cheap.
And the reduction, there's been a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as a result of that.
Yeah, about 100%.
Not 100%, but coal is really struggling right now.
Yes, agreed.
And to say that it's intimately linked to the opioid crisis is not an overstretch. Yes. By any means. So the acceleration of the decline of coal has come with certain social costs that we have to look at. Retraining of workers, finding new careers for people who were once coal miners, that's something to consider. And I'm not saying it's certainly something that we don't want to see happen, but with every choice that we make, there are reactions that we have to handle on the other side.
So I want to talk about gas in a minute, but first I want to talk about this 100% renewable. I can understand maybe 70 or 80% renewable. Tell me about 100% renewable.
So the 100% is always, we've done a lot of modeling and scenarios. We mentioned scenarios earlier where we've modeled what are the different how far you can go with variable renewables and then how far you can go with the mix of variable renewables and the non-variable renewables. And the 70 to 80% is economically possible with current technologies. It's that last 20% that, of course, gets much harder. Your incremental cost is going to be significantly more. And then if you throw in electrification, if you start electrifying your vehicle fleet, you're going to need significantly more. So this is where we're starting to look at different ways you can look at because there will be times you'll have more electrons than you need, and then there'll be times where you don't have enough. And if you look at technologies where you're actually producing hydrogen or other types, or desalinating water, or going through industrial processes that can be done in a batch process, that you can actually essentially store the energy for later use, for either thermal use or for reconversion back into electricity. So I think if we're going to try to get to 100%, or get greater than 60 or 70%, if you're not, again, counting our geothermal and hydropower, which have gotten us there already in some places. At that point, you're going to have to be starting to think of these intersector solutions and how you're going to make energy more flexible to go from place to place and to different types of uses.
Let's switch and talk for a moment about gas. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, but methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas. Talk a little bit about so our natural gas system is leaky. It's been like that for a long time because up until fairly recently we haven't worried too much about it. Talk a little bit about the problems of tightening up the natural gas supply and distribution systems so that we can dramatically reduce the leakage of methane.
Well, one of the things that's going on in Pennsylvania is a lot of infrastructure replacement on the utility side. So gas pipelines are being replaced, steel's coming out, plastics going in. Plastic's a lot more durable in the environment, less prone to leaks unless you hit it. You know, it can exist in the environment pretty safely unless there is earth disturbance. And so, you know, the investment in replacing infrastructure that's been around for 50, 70, 100 years is so important in getting that methane release reduced, but also being responsive to when you do have leaks, you know, or you do have pipeline construction work. And so as we're replacing the pipelines, we're actually taking the gas out of the pipelines we're purging and re-injecting that back into pipelines that are active going to customers, thus preventing more methane release. So it's responsible construction, it's replacing aging infrastructure, and being overly reactive to leaks and fixing them on a timely basis.
So I gave a talk at Tufts a week and a half ago, and I titled the talk, "On Climate Change, We're Toast, and if we don't get serious now, probably burnt toast." And that relates to this 100%. I mean, everything we've been hearing is wonderful. I'm delighted to hear that we're making progress, but it's so painfully slow, and I've been in this business a long time. So are we really burnt toast? I mean, is it the case that, that we're just not going to be able to, it looks to me like we're busting 3 or 4 degrees C, let alone getting down to 1.5 or 2. So, Jeremy, how is ClearPath with market mechanisms going to get us there?
Yeah. The short answer to your question is yes, we are toast. I think the clear data that is out there, both from IPCC and from even the U.S.'s National Climate Assessment, is it's really hard to see a scenario where we get to 1.5 degrees Celsius and let's say nearly impossible at 1.5 and really hard to get to 2. And that's why we need to have every tool in the toolbox. So this 100% clean versus renewable is critically important. Like, we need every type of technology to get to deeper decarbonization cuts.
So before you go on, is this whole panel in agreement that it's going to take a portfolio of pretty much everything we've got?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Keep going.
Yeah, and I would say that in general, there's really good modeling out there. In particular, one I'll point to you to that MIT and Jesse Jenkins did about a year ago that says that if you use flexible resources like Jill mentioned, like nuclear, like CCS, geothermal, bio, hydro, we can cut the cost of decarbonizing by 62%, because the real cost rises are when you get to that 70 to 80, 90% renewable scenarios. And another really key conclusion I think is important to think is batteries and demand response are not going to fill that 20% gap. You're going to need flexible assets, and so we're going to need things like nuclear, and I think that's a central debate here in Pennsylvania.
Batteries have gotten a whole lot cheaper, and there now are, there are now folks who are beginning to argue that I could go 100% renewable with if the learning curves on batteries continue as they have been. So do either of you have a view on that?
I think batteries are going to play one role. They're typically going to be only good for that 2 to 6 hour range, or maybe the life of your cell phone sort of range. And so I think they're going to have a specific role to play, but I think we will need things that can do longer term storage, seasonal storage, week-long storage. That's where you get into things like hydrogen or methane, other types of chemical storage and other things, or pump storage. So I think it's going to be, just like it'll be a portfolio on the generation side, it'll be a portfolio of storage technologies on the storage side.
Jeremy, I cut you off. You were.
No, I was going to say, I think there's an interesting debate here in Pennsylvania right now on this as we look at the existing nuclear fleet here. The legislature is considering proposals to keep those plants open. If they were shut down, it would be the equivalent, they would likely be replaced by natural gas, and it would be the equivalent of negating all renewables that have been deployed in PJM over the next 25 years.
Yeah,
so if we're driving to big emissions reductions, we've got to factor in those zero emission technologies.
So to calibrate on that, we've been making about 20% of our electricity in the United States with nuclear, and it's pretty clear we're not going to be able to build any more large 1,000-megawatt nuke plants. The cost overruns of the recent current generation plants have just been so horrendous. The situation in research on advanced nuclear technology through the Office of Nuclear at DOE is pardon my saying it, but we're basically dead in the water. There's no way we are going to get advanced nuclear at commercial scale before the middle of the century at the earliest, which means about the only thing available would be small modular light water reactors. And NuScale has a design which is probably going to get built on the Idaho National Lab site, but this is onesies and twosies. So NuScale maybe builds a 10-pack of 60 megawatt reactors on the Idaho site, and maybe the same thing is done at Oak Ridge. But it's really hard for me to see how nuclear, except for trying to find ways to keep current nuclear alive, it's hard for me to see how nuclear is going to contribute much to building an additional wedge. Now, you are absolutely right that if you keep closing down nuke plants, you just offset all the wind and solar that we've been building. Any thoughts on that from any of you?
Well, I think the new technology on natural gas plants is being much more efficient, higher heat rates, more electricity generated per MMBTU of gas. And I think you have to factor that in as that's replacing some of the coal plants as well. So I know you're not getting to your 100%, zero emissions, but you are taking steps in those directions, right?
Gas is great. It's about half the carbon intensity of coal.
Right.
But it's still half the carbon intensity of coal, which means his CCS technology has still got to kick in at some stage, even on gas plants. Yeah.
And then then actually fuel cells was brought up earlier too, and so when you look at efficiencies, that even takes another step further in efficiencies. When we think of the entire portfolio, this is one of these. As long as we set the target of where we're trying to go, do we think as a panel that the commercial sector with a clear target is going to take these technologies and continue to run with them?
If I'm supposed to be seeing questions on this thing, I'm not, and so.
Can I touch on the advanced nuclear?
But that's fine. I mean, we got plenty of stuff to talk about. What?
Can I touch on the advanced nuclear side?
Yeah,
just
please.
Real quick? I would disagree with your assertion that there isn't a glide path towards the 2035, 2040 time frame on advanced nuclear. There are a variety of new non-light water designs that are about to go
There's
through
all
NRC
sorts of stuff out there.
And
A lot of it's in view graphs, but yes. And that's great. But I can't see how it will have a dent in this problem we're talking about. 100% here we're talking about. I can't see how we can even get to a few percent by 2050.
I think we could, but I think we're going to need
it's
the
going to
whole
take a
suite of
dramatic
things.
change.
Yes. And I don't think it's going to be 60% carbon capture plus renewables. I think we're going to need to see all these technologies move in tandem. And I think gas plus CCS is another critical area. I think there's a really interesting technology you guys should to take a look at called Net Power in Texas. It's was recently invested in by Occidental Petroleum, and it's a zero-emission natural gas plant that could potentially be at price parity with combined cycle natural gas, produces a pure CO2 stream. They have a pilot that's functional down there. I mean, that could be revolutionary in the gas space.
So, Jeremy, my understanding is that ClearPath is not very enthusiastic about carbon prices, that is, carbon taxes. So what do you see as the policy strategies that get us even close to 100%?
Yeah, I would say we don't see a political path forward for a carbon tax, and certainly not at the price levels that would be necessary to really affect transportation emissions and industrial emissions. And so,
for those in the audience who don't know, $1 a ton carbon dioxide tax is a penny a gallon at the gas pump, and I can't see politically how you would get more than a $30 or $40 a ton carbon tax in place in the near term. And we all know that 30 or 40 cents a gallon at the gas pump doesn't do much in terms of fundamentally transforming the nature of the vehicle fleet. But excuse me, go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of interest has kind of ramped up in the kind of federal clean energy standards space or new source performance standards, things along those lines. And so we're going to kind of see a little more debate on those, I think, in Congress. But I think there does ultimately need to be some type of carbon signal. I don't think it's going to be a direct carbon price or tax, but something that sends the signal to industry that you need to be deploying low carbon technologies.
So
and it's
you're
nearly
talking about
impossible.
what, perforance standards or
potentially something along those lines that sets
any
benchmarks.
other views on the policy side of things here from the panel? I really I realize that some of you maybe are in an awkward position to espouse policy strategies. But
well, I'm certainly in that boat when it comes to policy, but I am a lot more bullish on the technology development than you are. I'm seeing advances in technology, whether it's alloy development, critical materials, advanced functional materials and alloys that all fit within the entire energy innovation landscape that are cross-cutting. It's in nuclear, it's in solar, it's in fossil, to where the pieces are all coming together in my mind. Now, as long the acceleration may need to happen, and that's where I think it's really inherent on the entire innovation ecosystem, from the academics at TRL levels 1, 2, 3, the national labs, filling in the gap, bringing in industry to where we create that conduit and pave the way for those innovations to get into the market, and then in policies can help create that demand side pull. But I'm a lot more bullish on technologies getting us there.
I'm bullish about technology. I'm just concerned about the enormous existing capital stock out there and how hard it is to get it turned over. I mean, 100% we're talking about. So, and you know, by 2050.
Hey, Granger.
Yeah.
Jay Whitaker over here. We have the questions from the audience over here. If you can't see them,
yeah, I'm not seeing them.
I'm going to lob one in just because it's
please
consistent here. This, I don't know who, it's an anonymous question, but it is fill in the blank. If all the nuke plants shut down tomorrow, blank would happen.
The grid would go dark. Our hospitals would shut down. Transportation of food would shut down.
If there was a controlled shutdown, if you were given 2 years to shut down the nuclear plants, what would you do?
Yeah, I would say actually we have a case study of that, and that's in Japan. After Fukushima, they shut all the nuclear power plants down, and it was sort of a comparable percent. And it was very difficult. My understanding is that, you know, there were a lot of challenges. People had to really conserve, energy. They cut out a lot of unnecessary energy. Now, it's a different system. They may have been more overbuilt than we are.
Carbon emissions went sky high.
Yes, and carbon emissions went up, but and it sparked a huge conversation in the nation about what to do about their power system.
Actually, it spread to Germany.
So I think it would be comparable.
So we could shut down our nukes, and we would have to replace them sooner or later, and we'd replace them with natural gas, or if we tried hard, we'd replace them with renewables. But as someone said, it would offset all the progress we've made, and then some, in terms of decarbonizing the system, because at the moment we would almost certainly replace them with technologies that are carbon intense. You want to add to that?
I would add to that it depends on who you ask.
Yeah, obviously.
So
there's a
tell
report
us about that.
There's a report that was published by the Public Utility Commissioner Andrew Place, independently of the commission, but I think the results, at least in his report, would show that most of our nuclear fleet is actually operating at a profit. 3 Mile Island is not, and that's largely because it's one reactor, not two. Even Beaver Valley, which is the other one that's been in dispute, does not appear to be in peril financially. So,
but the question was, if we shut them all down, what would happen?
I'm not clear why we would shut them all down.
No,
my point.
that's obvious.
Fair,
yes.
fair.
Well, and I missed the word nuclear in there, and so my catastrophic scenario was
well, I mean, I don't know that you're wrong,
tomorrow.
Brian. It's such a large fraction of the.
If it did happen tomorrow, actually, our grid. I mean, we would have serious grid
stressed.
ramifications if it happened immediately.
I don't
but,
disagree with that.
Do we got any other questions out there?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll just keep going.
Well,
I have one more.
I was going to add just because the nuclear piece and profitability in the nuclear space brings up that additional question of how we monetize the electric generation fleet.
Sure, and how we monetize
in the light of resilience. And
yes,
so baseload
exactly.
power right now, especially low carbon baseload power, perhaps we need to revisit how we monetize baseload nuclear.
I agree.
So this next question visits sort of the thing I think Brian was talking about the cost adder for CCS, and the question specifically is: would you tie that cost adder directly, specifically to coal? Would you socialize it more broadly to energy use? Would you stigmatize coal more because that needs the most CCS action on it? Would you do an extra price adder per ton sold to the power plant, for example, or would you spread it out differently? Like, where's the best place, or what are the options, do you think, for imparting this financial burden that CCS brings?
Well, and that sounds, in addition to Brian, a question for Jeremy as well.
Well, the policy, as long as it's transparent, I think is going to bring the commercial sector into trying to commercialize the technologies. In terms of whether one fuel source should have different sets of requirements, again, it goes back to the goal. Are we trying to incentivize zero carbon emissions, and a fuel that has a bigger barrier to get to zero carbon emissions maybe inherently, just without creating some artificial model, might have its own challenges and barriers. And so I'm a little more free market on that space. And that's why it's really important just to develop the innovations that can be applicable to coal, to natural gas, and to be able to capture and sequester at a low enough price. And I think the market will take care of it because the innovations are going to be there for the technologies to commercialize.
Yeah, although the time constants in the market are, a few years, and we got a problem here that's got time scales of decades. Jeremy, do you want to add to this one?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say as you look at project finance, things along those lines, and the incentives we have for clean energy, ultimately a federal tax incentive spreads that out among the entire population, right? It's a federal tax incentive, and so just like 45Q would incentivize it for gas or coal and capture on those, the solar ITC and the wind PTC has been spread out for, frankly, over a decade. And so, I mean, I guess the real question is, what is our outcome desired? And if it's ultimately to drive down emissions, like, yes, we should have at least limited government policies that drive towards that long-term goal, because we think it's important for both environmental and economic.
So let's go back to the title one more time. We've got clean, and we got renewable, and we got zero carbon. I guess my personal view would be that that clean and zero carbon are perhaps more important than that we go 100% renewables. I mean, renewables are good, but clean. I mean, the change from coal to gas in this state has also resulted in a lot fewer excess deaths because of the resulting improvement in air quality. Do we have views about the relative importance of clean versus renewable versus zero? Anybody want to take that one on?
Well, I think, zero carbon to me is just one of the pollutants that we have to worry about. I mean, it's a global pollutant. It's certainly one that we probably address the least. Clean has a very squishy definition. No one's really defined it, but it includes carbon. It maybe includes particulates, it includes sulfur, it includes water pollution, it includes, you can get into the entire supply chains of issues. Renewable, of course, is a very specific technology, and I would say, you can have a goal of 100% renewable that may help you achieve the other two goals, but you can also achieve those other two goals with, other technologies as well.
Anybody want to add on that one? We have other questions from the floor, otherwise we'll just keep going. Yes, go ahead. Yell, since we're not... Volker, you got to step to the right, or because there's a camera right behind you and your head is probably in the middle of it. Okay, so the question is, what can individual institutions like Carnegie Mellon do? And I think you've argued, for example, that maybe one could convert to combined heat and power and get substantial energy efficiency improvements, and maybe,
Absolutely. I mean, Carnegie Mellon is one of the tenants of Bellafield Boiler, which was an old coal-fired steam plant that distributed steam to the campuses here as well as the University of Pittsburgh. And I know they've looked at putting combined heat and power there where they could tie into the electric distribution system on campus to produce electricity as well as producing the steam needed to heat these buildings. I think that's a really good step. I think also looking at fuel cell technology also is a very good step towards, not only doing the same function as what engine-driven CHP, but also doing it in a way which is almost zero emissions.
So Denise, what are Pennsylvania state government buildings doing in this respect?
We're looking at reducing, looking at energy efficiency first and foremost in state buildings, 3% per year improvements in energy efficiency for a total of 21% in 7 years. That's first and foremost. And then the second piece of it was the vehicle fleet. So, and there's a bunch of other things articulated.
What are you doing on the vehicle fleet?
Every agency will need to convert, I believe it's 25% of their fleet to electric vehicles. So we're going to lead by example. I did want to go back to the gentleman's question about Carnegie Mellon. Any university could really be a living lab for this kind of energy systems architecture. These are the places where you can redefine what your energy mix looks like and show the world what can be done. This is like a small town, really. And you have all of the right assets in terms of intellect and capabilities to really do something unique in that space.
Okay, I think we have another question coming from the floor.
So,
go ahead.
Last question. What reasonable changes can we expect to see in our energy infrastructure in the next 5 years, and are there policy barriers that we could work to remove?
Say it again. Say the first half.
What changes can we expect to see in our energy infrastructure in the next 5 years?
Yeah.
And policy barriers.
Thoughts across the panel.
I can answer some of that from a micro level, just from Pennsylvania's standpoint. We have significant pipeline infrastructure going in the ground, and it's not going in the ground really to serve Pennsylvania. It's largely going to serve external markets. And I think that's an important part of this conversation as well, is that while we're a producer of gas, we're also an exporter of gas. 80% of our natural gas will be exported internationally and domestically. There's also, I believe, grid transformations going on right now with transmission and distribution. But more importantly, we're seeing a really strong drive towards microgrid technology, combining that with the things that Jeff talked about, combined heat and power, renewables in the same system. Those types of smaller scale grid systems really give us greater resiliency, which will be part of addressing climate in the future.
In the 2 or 3 minutes we've got left, microgrids are very interesting, but they're not legal unless it's a public utility that's building them. I mean, if I, as an independent developer, want to build a microgrid and serve several companies in an industrial park or something, there are exclusive service territory rules in the state of Pennsylvania, as there are in almost all states. And so the rate at which microgrids have been introduced is dramatically slower than it could have been if state legislatures would figure out some way to make it legal to develop microgrids down under distribution systems. I presume, for example, that the gas companies might find it quite interesting to be able to market these ideas. And so maybe that's one issue that the state ought to be, that the legislator ought to be working on.
The state is very focused on microgrids right now.
Okay, I will wrap this up with 30 seconds from each of us things that didn't get talked about that should have been.
It almost came up, but I think a one-size-fits-all solution for the entirety of the United States and 330 million people is not going to work. If we look at Iceland, so the examples of geothermal and hydro, Iceland and Norway have specific geologies. The United States is going to have many different solutions.
Okay, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, and just say that, especially when we look beyond power sector, when we start talking about industrial and transportation, sorry, we're going to need technologies like CCS and nuclear to deal with those hard-to-abate sectors, or there's no way we're going to reduce emissions to the point that we need to for climate reasons.
Jill, 30 seconds.
Yeah, he stole mine. I was going to say industrial processes is not something we've talked about. We've been a lot of focus on the power system, but I think now it's time we need to be focused in power and buildings, and now it's time we need to be focused on agriculture, on industry, on the other things in our sectors that use a lot of this energy in different forms, in form of fuels and heat, and as well as electricity. And I think that's going to be the next big sectors that we're going to need to be approaching.
I don't think we got to my question, which was what is not allowing us to get to the goals that are out there. And I think that's part of a longer discussion and how we have to create bigger tables.
I think partly what's not allowing us is that I can emit CO2 or methane into the atmosphere for free. And as long as I can do that, some of this stuff's going to be really hard to incentivize.
Well, I'm encouraged that we're moving in the right direction with technology, but I'm also encouraged with using, changing the way we view microgrids and incorporating those into how we develop new communities and help campuses like CMU to adopt energy as well as renewable, natural gas technology, everything combined within one space and showing it like a lab, like Denise had said, and helping other people think about that technology and adopting it in a broader scale.
Okay, and my closing comment is every time you see one of these 100-car coal trains rumbling through Pittsburgh, remember that about 80% of that is going to be an invisible gas in the atmosphere in a few days. Remember that there are thousands of plants doing that all around the world, and that once you put it up there, a third of it or more is going to be there for our great-grandchildren. Thanks very much for all of you, and this was good.